Welcome everyone to the effective writing course here. You remember you met me for about 2 minutes a week or two ago. I'm Paul Casella. I am a writer and a filmmaker. I'm with the Office of Faculty Affairs and Development here, and my job is to give these types of classes to faculty and trainees here at Iowa, and then also edit manuscripts for submissions to journals and edit grant applications. My background is not as a scientist, not as a physician, but as a poet and a filmmaker. And you can probably tell right now, I'm not from Iowa City originally, I'm from New York. Could you tell that? I got here in 1988. The first thing I thought was, this would be a great chance for me to lose my accent. And the second thing I thought was, that's all I got left. I'm going to hold on to it. But no, I came here for the Writers' Workshop. I had gotten into the program, typical New Yorker, opened up a map. I found Idaho, I found Ohio, I split the difference, found Iowa. But as you know, it's a great place for writers and for thinkers, great place to be able to reflect. What I say is, you got to look at that cornfield and you got to see an ocean, right? My goal today, again, is to give you the strategies and skills that you can employ to become an effective writer. Writing is very important for your professional development, I'd argue, in any career that you go to. But because we're here as students of the sciences, let me emphasize that, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't communicate them effectively, then, they really won't have any impact. So you hear from me today about effective writing, and we'll touch on also, as we alluded to last week, personal statements and application writing. Here's an outline of what I plan to do today. We're going to look at common problems people have with writing. And oftentimes, a major common problem is getting started, that writer's block that we encounter. So I have some strategies on how you can overcome that and get the writing process to actually work for you. I have at the bottom to talk about the writing process. And this is a very important concept here. Many people look at writing as something that you do after you've done the thinking, as a means to disseminate the ideas. I'm going to address here today how, in fact, you can use writing as a means to come up with better ideas, to see the trends or the patterns emerging in your thinking so that you can identify where you are most interested or the topics you're most interested in pursuing. And you know that if you work on something that you're interested in, you take a lot stronger approach to it, and you can be a more effective contributor to that area. Of course, we'll talk about clarity, and clarity is very important. In a nutshell, it doesn't come out perfectly the first time you do it. So again, in the writing process, a big part of it is to recognize that that first draft is just a first draft and not a final product. I used a quote from Thomas Jefferson to emphasize the role of clarity. And the story goes like this. He was asked to write the Declaration of Independence. He thought it over. He decided ultimately he would go ahead and do that. And in a letter to a friend, he described that decision. And he put it like this, that he sought to do it, he sought to write it, and here's the quote, in terms so clear and direct as to command their consent. Kind of a brilliant quote. Terms so clear and direct as to command their consent. In other words, he's going to write it in such a way that the readers cannot help but agree with those terms. That's how we're going to look at clarity, and we'll focus on the ways you can be clear in your writing. In scientific writing, how many interpretations do you as an author want your reader to get from something you've written? We're not talking about a poetry or a short story, right? Where if I write a poem and someone gets, 15 different interpretations, that's a good poem. But in science writing, how many interpretations do you want your reader to get? A single interpretation. How many times do you want your reader to read that sentence or that paragraph to get that single interpretation? Ideally just once. And then, of course, my third question is, how many times do you find yourself rereading sentences and paragraphs because you just didn't get it the first time? Yeah, I see some smiles. way too many times. So our goal is to convey the information in such a clear and direct way so the reader gets a single, unified interpretation that's available the first time through. We'll talk more about that later when I talk about some people who have influenced me or especially taught me some of the subtleties of writing and things you can employ to make your writing more effective. We'll look at the concept of deconstructing and modeling your writing. Fancy word, deconstructing, but basically what it means is to look at an example of a good piece of writing and deconstruct it or take it apart to inform the type, the format, the structure of what you want to write. So you can do this on a paragraph level, where if you simply identify the purpose of each of the paragraphs of a given article, ideally if you're ready to, for instance, put it into a submission to a journal, you would go to that journal, you would see how they do things, see how they structure those types of articles. You can do this exercise identifying, what goes on in each paragraph and come away with a 22 to 28 point outline, which then you can insert your ideas into in the proper order. And that way, you know that you are using an editorial approved format, one that will allow the reviewers to concentrate on the content of what you have to say instead of trying to figure out what you're trying to say. This I hear from reviewers of grant writing, of grant applications all the time. It's very frustrating for them when they have to try to figure out what the author's trying to convey. And it has an impact on their ability to understand and can dampen their enthusiasm for the project that they propose. So as psychological as I'll get today, and we talk about reader-based writing. In a few weeks, we'll talk about audience-based speaking. From the psychology of reviewers' perspective, the psychology of readers' perspective, a reader has just so much brain power. And the clearer and more direct the writing, the more that the writing satisfies the reviewer expectations, then the more brain power that reader has to put into the ideas that you're suggesting. Conversely, the harder it is to figure out, the more the reader has to dig and interpret the structure of the writing, then the less brain power that reader has to actually remember your ideas. So again, emphasizing the importance of clarity and fulfilling reviewer expectations. So deconstructing and modeling. You can take apart an example and then you model your writing after it. The same can be said for a set of instructions. You might have a set of instructions, 3 or 4 different lines of instructions. The idea is you can deconstruct those instructions to the extent that you would do the same exercise, but instead on the paragraph level, you would actually do it on the sentence level. So for instance, in the project description of the NIH grant application, there are about 3 or 4 sentences, and you could come away with an outline that's about 7 or 8 points long. And the good writers give them that information exactly in the order that they ask for it. So we're taking away the need to reinvent the wheel every time that you have to write something. Use models, use instructions to inform the structure of your writing. What we'll do is, looking at the structure, organization of the different formats of your writing, we'll look at the natural positions of emphasis in these different formats. So we'll take it from the sentence, we'll take it through the paragraph, and that is an example of looking at a larger document. We'll examine closely the report of original research. The good news is, in scientific writing, there are about, I'm going to call it about 8 or 10 types of articles you'll read and you'll write. The report of original research is the gold standard, let's call it. But there are review articles, and there are case studies and case series. Again, a variety of different types, textbook chapters, whole books. The good news is that those structures have evolved over the years to help authors with their reasoning, to help them authorize their writing. And we think about this term authorize, authorize. You authorize your claims by doing the work of an author, authorize. The work of an author in any of these formats, and again, in particular, we'll look at the report of original research, the role of the author is to account for the development of the ideas through each of the different sections of a given article, of a document. We'll look at the report of original research again closely because that is one of the main types of articles you'll be looking at in journal clubs, in labs, in your classes in this area. We'll apply a test of reasoning to these structures so you can examine the extent to which, again, the authors have made credible their claims, have authorized those claims. And you can apply this to the articles that you write, certainly, but also very important as students, as you read these different articles, you can apply this test of reasoning to the articles that you read and that you examine and that you learn from and how to do science. Again, from my background as a poet and a writer, and not being a scientist, or really the last science class I took in college was oceanography to satisfy that requirement. It was at Dartmouth, by the way. I don't know if you came from there. But interesting, not knowing the scientific part, but knowing what I know about writing and knowing what I know about the structures and the role of different sections of a given article, I can, for instance, tell a faculty member here when he or she hasn't fully substantiated their claims in a manuscript. So we're taking this from an editorial perspective. And again, the writing process, very important. In a word, writing is a process. Writing takes a number of steps to get something into a good shape that you want to share with your colleagues in an application, in a manuscript. If you go into a project knowing it's going to take a number of different steps, it makes it a lot easier to ultimately come to something that's submittable, that's worthy of sharing with your classmates, your colleagues. So I wanted to mention a few people that influenced me. And while we're busy talking about the writing process, I'll mention William Zinsser. He's an author and a writer of books, not only on effective writing, but also more like a journalist. So he's got a book that visits many national parks, and he talks to the superintendent, and he talks to the janitor, and he talks to the visitor. So he's really a reporter. He taught at Yale for many years, consummate New Yorker. It's Zinsser that I learned most about what I'm about to convey about the writing process. And a quote that I remember from the half a day that I had with him in my group in New Haven, he said, "If you take care of the process, the product will take care of itself." Or in his book called Writing to Learn, my favorite quote is that you can use writing as a tool for thinking. Again, not just a means to disseminate the ideas, but a means to come up with better ideas. Here's how Zinsser describes the initial problem that authors have, again, in those first drafts. He says there's A writers and there are B writers. A writers are very rare. These are the people who don't struggle with the writing process like most of us do. These people have, let's call it, decades of experience of reading good writing and a familiarity with the different structures of the writing. A writer can sit down and say, okay, I'm ready to write my first draft, and that first draft will come out pretty well organized, about as close to a perfect first draft as you can get. But again, decades of experience of familiarity with these different formats. Most of us, Zinsser says, are B writers. We can think about it, we can organize it, we can reflect on it, but no matter what, whenever we start writing, if anything comes out at all, it comes out all mishmashed, and it makes no sense, and it's very discouraging. I mean, we won't even get into procrastination, because procrastination is like the easiest thing to do when you're faced with a writing project. So much easier to check email and do all those tiny, small projects than to take on a big project. The main thing I learned from the many time management classes I've been to is that if you have a big project, the best way to approach it is to divide it up into many smaller projects and just knock off the smaller ones one at a time. So Zinsser's solution to this initial problem with the writing process is to not worry about the final project early on. Don't yet deconstruct that model article, but just go ahead and allow yourself to become a B writer. Do what he calls free writing, and write whatever occurs to you. Maybe don't even write sentences and paragraphs, because sentences and paragraphs are not easy to put together. Just make a laundry list of your ideas. Or I go into faculty offices here at Iowa, and I see 2 or 3 of these whiteboards on the walls, and they have circles and lines and shapes and decision trees and conceptual models, and they're literally living in the realm of their ideas and using those lists and those diagrams as a means to inform their writing. In fact, another person I'll talk about is my buddy Abraham Verghese, who's a physician and a funded investigator, and he's got 2 nonfiction books out, and most recently, about 10 years ago, a novel, 555 pages long, awesome novel called Cutting for Stone. So next time you have a good week on a beach, bring that along with you, Cutting for Stone. Anyway, I walked into his house at Stanford last summer, and he tells me he's always wanted to take his living room and make it into his writing room, and basically that's what it is. His living room is got a gigantic desk and a gigantic whiteboard behind it, about 3 times this size, and not only does he have notes all over it, but he's drawn, in a couple places, pictures of the characters of his novel. So very cool. I told him I wanted a photograph of it, but then if I took a photograph, I'd just be showing it, and so we decided I wouldn't take a picture of it. Back to Zinsser. He says, do free writing. This is essentially this 15 minutes a day, a writing assignment that we've given you. And then after you've collected enough information, then you start to consider your reader. So again, we talk about reader-based writing. And then you start to consider the models that you're expected to write in. And then you say, okay, I said the same thing twice here, and it goes up here, and this goes here, and this thing goes down here, and this goes down here. In other words, it's important to recognize that there are at least 2 stages of the writing process, at least 2. First one being the way you get your ideas, the intuitive stage, which is pretty random, sometimes mysterious, and then the reorganizing stage for the reader, the didactic stage, the one in which you put those ideas in a format that is rememberable to that reader, that makes sense to the reader. Of course, I'm going to ultimately add a 3rd stage, and that would be when you solicit feedback from your colleagues, from your mentors, from your classmates, to improve the quality of that writing. But that's still down the road a little bit. So again, the point there is recognize that it doesn't come out the best the first time. It takes a number of different stages. And again, Zinsser, writing is a tool for thinking. Another person I want to bring up early on, I mentioned him just now already, is Abraham Verghese, Verghese. And I'll get to his story in a minute. But the idea of keeping a log of your ideas on a daily basis, 15 minutes a day, every day for 49 days, and then rereading all that information, an hour or two it would take you to go through all that information, is one way that you can use writing as a tool for thinking. And I explain this with my Weather Channel analogy. So it's 1988, I moved from New York City to Iowa City, and we get cable TV. And so my favorite channel is the Weather Channel because it would show the Earth from outer space. I mean, I knew it was a computer mock-up, but I thought that was cool. So what the Weather Channel taught me about writing is when they put the radar map in motion. So what, they take 5 hours of radar data and they do a little time lapse, and as a result, you can see the weather patterns happening. My question to you is, if you're in a spaceship in real time looking down in North America, do you get the same insight into the weather that you do in that time-lapse version? No. Why not? Because in real time, those weather patterns move too slowly, right? You need some type of tool to put the map in motion, or do a little time lapse on that radar data to see the patterns emerge. My whole point is that because you live your academic life in real time, you need some sort of tool to be able to put the map in motion, as it were, and to see the patterns emerge. And again, if you write a page a day every day in your log for 49 days, and then you read that in the hour or so it takes you to read that, you'll be taking, well, I don't know, 105 minutes times 5 weeks, that's, 500 plus minutes of thinking collapsed into 60 minutes, and you'll be able to see those patterns emerge. That's the whole rationale behind a page a day every day in your log. Much better than putting in 8 hours of writing every Sunday, 5 Sundays in a row. My friend Abraham's story is also illustrative of this. So he was a classmate of mine in the workshop, and his story is pretty unique. He had about 10, 12 years of experience in the real world, being a doctor, before he went on and did this Master of Fine Arts in creative writing. Most of us had gone to college, and then a year or two later we were at the Writers' Workshop. I actually got in, and then I deferred a year because they didn't give me any tuition assistance. So I thought I'd defer a year and give them a year to let them come to their senses, And that year actually is a good, I did essentially the same approach to that writing process. So I tried to find a job in filmmaking or in publishing, but there weren't many to be had that would pay any money. So ultimately I got a job as a paralegal, and it was a bankruptcy firm on Wall Street, 67 Wall Street. The cool thing about that is that it was the exact same building that my grandmother worked in when she was a young woman as a secretary. So that was cool. So anyway, it's the fall of '87. I have no luck trying to get a job in filmmaking or in publishing. Black Friday hits, stock market crashes. All my friends in college who went on to get investment banker jobs get laid off, and I got a job at a bankruptcy firm, right? So I knew I was going to be coming to Iowa and wanted to write poetry. I knew I wanted to create a body of work to be able to mine ideas from. And so I bought a little pocket recorder. And back in 1987, they had those mini cassette recorders, and it was $250. So it was a week's take-home pay to buy this thing. And I would have to walk, as a paralegal, my job was to go to the different courthouses and deliver papers and that sort of thing. So every day I go to the Southern District, which is just a few blocks away on the southern tip of Manhattan. And then later on, I would take the train to Brooklyn. I'd go to the Eastern District, bankruptcy court, file my papers, whatever, and then walk back to the office over the Brooklyn Bridge. Essentially the whole time talking into that recorder, making a body of information. So I was ruthless. I would go across in rainstorms, in the sweltering heat, every day that I was working. And then I would later transcribe it. So by the time I came to Iowa, I had a inch or two thick stack of transcriptions, again, from which I could mine for the poetry that I was writing. Anyway, I get to Iowa, I meet Abraham, and he Because he had some experience, actually pretty moving experience as a physician in Tennessee before coming here, he graduates with a book contract, okay? Most of us get an MFA, and as my grandfather would say, that and a token will get you a ride on the subway, right? But Abraham had met some editors here, and he'd done lots of good work, and he graduates with a book contract. And now he's got to write the book. So his story is this. He was raised in Ethiopia to Indian parents who were teachers there. He went to medical school in India, ultimately came to the US, did his training here, established himself as a faculty, and he's doing research in pulmonary issues. He's an infectious disease expert. He said he went into infectious diseases because he could cure people. But, of course, the HIV epidemic hits, and essentially the sons of Johnson City, Tennessee, come home to die. And this is a very moving experience. His patients are dying on him now. So he has kind of a crisis of career. He turns to writing as a means to deal with it, gets more interested, does a summer writing program here at Iowa, and then ultimately gets his MFA at Iowa, and again, meets this editor, graduates, he's got a book contract, and now he's going to write the book. Well, he's also got to support a family, and they moved to Texas, to El Paso. And I remember him telling the story to me in his office there in Texas, El Paso. He was the head of the residency program in internal medicine. He's got to write the book, so what he does is he sets his alarm clock for 4:30 every morning, and he gets up and he starts typing about his experiences. A couple hours later, showers, goes to the hospital, rounds with the residents, has his day. And the way he put it to me, he said, some days somebody would say something that would trigger a solution to what he had been writing about that morning. And he says he knows it wasn't divine inspiration. He knows it was because he had been sensitizing himself to the issue by writing about it that morning or the previous mornings. Meanwhile, fast forward 20 years, and I'm telling this very story at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and someone in my front right table here says to me, this is what the cognitive psychologists call the incubation of ideas, or the fermentation of ideas, or just pick your favorite process, right? The idea is that if you write a page a day, every day, in the log of your ideas, we're not talking about keeping a diary, we're talking about a log of your professional ideas and aspirations, you will better sensitize yourself and have a better chance to get insights into those ideas. Just thinking ahead and how we'll talk about effective presenting skills, one thing you can do is go to Google Verghese TED Talk, and you can see his TED Talk in Edinburgh about 3-4 years ago, an example of a really good speaker. So we recognize that part of becoming a good writer is to read good writing. Part of becoming a good speaker is to see good speakers. And for the most part, I'm going to call it 90% of the TED Talk speakers represent good delivery skills also. Thinking about getting ideas from your writing, or think about, in general, how we get our ideas, our better ideas, or more precisely, when we get our best ideas. The question is, what were you doing when you last got your best idea? Well, I'll just jump ahead right to the answer. The answer is something else, right? I was biking on the way to class. The number one answer is I was in the shower. How come you get your best ideas in the shower, right? Because you're naked and wet? I don't know. There's a speaker on the emergency medicine circuit, Cordell Jepson, talks about if you get your best ideas in the shower, you should have a set of those wax pencils there on the ledge so you can write them down and before you forget them. That's another question I ask. How many times in the course of your day are you busy doing something else and you do get insight into a particular situation? And you say to yourself, that's pretty insightful of me. I'm going to remember that and write that down later. Then what happens? You never remember that great insight. And almost worse, you never remember you had that moment of understanding at all. Another quality of good writing is the ability to capture that idea when you get it. And now that we have smartphones, it's a lot easier. I used to tell physicians, you go to that nearest phone in the hallway of the hospital and dial your own number and leave yourself a voicemail, right? Now you get notes pages and you send yourself texts. There's really no reason to not record that insight when you get it. Okay, so that's some on the writing process, and that's my best case for, by taking a measured approach to the writing process, you can come up with better ideas, and again, at least see where your true interests lie. Now we'll look at more of the natural positions of emphasis in the different parts of your writing. And this information I get from George Gopen, head of the writing program at Duke University, when he talked to us. If you really want to dig deep into this, you can Google the article, The Science of Scientific Writing. The Science of Scientific Writing, what you're going to hear in the next 10, 15 minutes, quick summary, especially as it applies to the sentence, but that article would pop up pretty quick. Gopen and Swan, George Gopen and Judith Swan. We talked about how you want to forward, ideally, a single interpretation that's available to the reader the first time through. Gopen says that's theoretically impossible. He says the best an author can do is make available to the reader the interpretation that the author wants the reader to get. He says that 85% of the misunderstanding between the writer and the reader is due to structural issues, and only 15% due to contextual issues. Again, that's why we're going to emphasize structure. So, again, coming from an editorial perspective, we're going to look at the structure of the sentence and the paragraph and the report of original research as a means to identify the natural position of emphasis so that you can take advantage of that and be a more effective writer. And we'll do an exercise in that direction as well. So let's start with the sentence then. You remember a sentence got a subject and a verb, starts with a capital and ends with a period. And my $10 question is, when do you know to put the period? When you run out of breath? No, that's not the answer. I mean, dictation is a great way to get a first draft going, but what does a period tell the reader of a sentence? It's called an end stop as well, right? So you've come to the end of what? A thought. I want to emphasize the word a thought. Especially when we're talking about more complex writing, such as scientific writing can be, the idea, the thing I have to remind people of, even though we learned this back in whatever, second grade, is the guideline for the sentence is one idea per sentence. When you're in your free writing brainstorming mode, do you worry about this? No, just keep on getting that stuff out. But later, as you turn into your editing mode, you want to make sure that you have manageable sentences. Sentences that have essentially one idea and not 3 or 4 ideas in them. In fact, one of the more common edits I make here at the University of Iowa is take sentences with 1, 2, maybe 3 ideas and to break them out into their individual units. If you think about that guideline at 1 idea per sentence, and if an author were to put 1, 2, 3 ideas in one long string of words, then what's the overall effect on each of those individual ideas? They get diluted a little bit, right? They get lost. So for me to say this in the affirmative, it would be to say, give each of your ideas the format it deserves. Okay, so again, now we're shifting into more of that editing, that revising mode. 1 idea per sentence. Okay, so now we'll do the exercise that Gopen did with my small group back in New Haven in, 1995 or so. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a sentence, and I'm going to ask you to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down as to whether you agree to undergo this theoretical treatment. Okay? So thumbs up or thumbs down. Although the treatment is highly effective, it has significant side effects. Okay, erase your votes. I'm going to give you another sentence, and you do the same thing, thumbs up or thumbs down. Although the treatment has significant side effects, it is highly effective. Okay, so do you find yourself voting two different ways? Exact same words, but we just shifted the organization. Now, we're not yet talking about the subtlety yet here. There was one word in those sentences that essentially taught you how to think about the issue, taught you how to vote. What word was it? The although, right? In both those cases, the although, we English teachers call this a subordinator. The although was a cue to the reader that whatever was in the although part, the although phrase, was subordinate or less important than what was in the main clause. So when the side effects was subordinated and the effectiveness was in the main clause, you're more likely to say yes. To examine the subtlety, what we'll do is we'll take the although out, and I'll ask you to vote one more time. The treatment is highly effective, but it has significant side effects. So I'm seeing like maybe 2, 3 votes, 4 votes. A lot harder to tell, my whole point is. And even the word but throws a little interpretation in there. So let's make it more difficult. We'll take the but out as well. The treatment is highly effective and it has significant side effects. Oh, good, I get both, right? So the question is, where we don't have a feature embedded in the language, like the word although, a subordinator, the main question that we have to deal with is, where is the natural position of emphasis in the sentence? Does it occur in the first half of the sentence, or does it occur in the second half of the sentence? I heard second half, and that's right. I guessed first half, but that may be because I studied poetry and we capitalized that first letter. Gopin makes a strong point for how in American English, the natural position of emphasis, what he calls the stress position, is the second half of the sentence. And thinking about that, let me organize the sentence for you, as Gopin did for us, and I think you'll be able to see the logic in it. He says in the subject position, or what he calls the topic position of the sentence, subject, in the subject position, it makes sense that one would put the old, backward-looking information that's familiar to the reader, information the reader expects. And in the verb position, you've been taught to use action verbs, and by all means do so wherever possible, but you're not going to get away from linking verbs, forms of to be. They're perfectly appropriate too. They're like equal signs. And then it makes sense that in the natural position of emphasis, you would put the new information, the information that is more important, the information that you want to emphasize. My analogy for the sentence in the body of a paper is that it's like a step you would take on a hike. You want to take a step on a hike, first you have to have some familiar territory, some footing. I see this as the subject position. The verb obviously is the action, kicking out your leg and firing your muscles. And then the new territory you come across, where your weight comes down, I see this as the position of emphasis. Why is the second half of the sentence the natural position of emphasis? According to Gopin, it's because it is the last information left with the reader. It is the moment of closure of the sentence. And this is where it starts to get foofy, because Americans are looking for closure. Let me give you an example. This comes from a grant application I read actually before I had had this session with Gopin. I was reading this application to edit it, and the music was a little off to my ear. And the sentence read, "Development of an animal model for lightning injury is the goal of this proposal. And I thought, is that the best way to say it? Or would it be better if we said, the goal of this proposal is to develop an animal model for lightning injury? I see heads nodding. It makes sense. That second way makes a lot more sense. Because every proposal has a goal. That's nothing new. That's expected. Notice that top-heavy, four-syllable, big word, development, it changed in the revision to a verb, is to develop. So that was a good change already also. And then this animal model for lightning injury, this new and exciting part, gets put in the natural position of emphasis. Do you worry about this when you're in the free writing brainstorming stage? No, right? The idea then is to get it out on paper. This is something you consider when you are editing it for to be submitted somewhere or in preparation to get some feedback from your mentors, from your classmates. Do you write every sentence, or do you organize every sentence that you write according to this organization? I would say no, not either. You would probably pay more attention to the important sentences. There's a lot to be said for variety in your sentences, and to, especially I should mention now, variation of the lengths of your sentences. Much better, instead of having 4 medium-length sentences in a row or 4 long sentences in a row, to have a nice short one to start, a longer one, a medium-length one, and another short one. Variation in the lengths of the sentences also keeps readers interested. So you're happy typing away in Microsoft Word, and you notice the green squiggly underline. Oftentimes that's the passive voice, right? I'm here to say that the passive construction is not evil, as you might have been taught. It's perfectly appropriate, and in fact, the whole answer to whether you use the active voice versus the passive voice has everything to do with this. What do you want to put in the more important part of the sentence? You put in the more important part of the sentence, and you decide on the active or passive voice to allow it to fit. So let me go 2 minutes into active versus passive construction. It's worth reviewing. For every sentence you want to write, you can either put it in the active or the passive construction. The active construction is a form of to be, plus an ending, usually ends in ed or sometimes in en, and there's some other outlier formats. But quickly to review. In the active voice, we have the subject, the doer of the action, we have the verb, and then we have the object, or the recipient of the action of the verb. For example, she wrote the book. For every sentence we can say in the active voice, we could put in the passive construction as well, the passive voice, and the passive voice turns that around. It becomes the object first, then the verb, then sometimes the subject. So she wrote the book becomes in the passive construction, the book was written by her. And we see now already 4 words versus 6 words. In fact, the passive construction takes about 20 or 30% more words to put to convey a sentence in. And this, I think, is the main reason why you were taught to use the active construction wherever possible. Well, again, I'm saying that you might have to ignore that green squiggly underline in Microsoft Word that's pointing out the passive voice, because if you use the passive construction as a means to put the more important information in the stress position, or the new information in the stress position, then the passive construction would be worth it. So just to go back to my example, if you, for instance, she wrote the book, that sentence to me would be put more emphasis on the book, right? The book would be the more important thing. Or if we turned it around in the passive construction, the book was written by her, that would mean that you'd want to put more emphasis on the author, the her there. Any questions at this point? I should have mentioned, I'm given this talk about 986 times before, so I'm comfortable if you throw out any questions, any comments. All right, so feel free, again, to shout out any questions. We put a bunch of sentences together, so we're going to move on to the next structure of writing. You put a bunch of sentences together, what do you get? Paragraph, right? And you remember the paragraph symbol. Let's say, for argument's sake, we have a 4-sentence paragraph, which frankly, in my mind, is plenty long enough. Now, the length of your paragraphs will depend on the purpose that you're writing for. Let's say you're writing to submit to a journal that has long paragraphs. Well, you have more of a right to put your information in longer paragraphs. Let's say you're writing to a journal that has shorter ones. So I'm thinking of JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine. The introductions are fairly short paragraphs. You know, you can only get 2, maybe 3 of them at most. And if you were writing for that form, then you'd follow that format. The question is now, which 2 sentences are in a greater position of emphasis than the other 2 sentences in the paragraph? The first and last one, exactly. The first and last sentences get more emphasis, attention than the ones in the middle. So the first point here is, don't bury important information in the middle of the paragraph. It has a better chance of getting lost. If it's important, put it to the top, put it to the bottom. If we had to decide between the first versus the last, then which one of those gets more emphasis than the other? The last is a good point to make, and in fact I'll acknowledge that writing theory says that an author teaches a reader how to read a document by setting up certain conventions and by following through on them. Textbook chapters, for instance, very well may do that. They might put the more important sentence at the bottom of the paragraph. And that is for the type of writing in which the reader would read it more in a linear fashion. So, for instance, if the main idea, the topic sentence, the most important sentence, occurs at the bottom of the first paragraph, where should it occur in the rest of the paragraphs in that document? Likewise, at the bottom, in the same position. I'm going to make a case, however, for the more important sentence being the first sentence of the paragraph. My analogy for the first sentence in the paragraph is a bucket. It gives the reader a context. It gives the reader a means to carry around the rest of the information in that paragraph. So by giving the topic sentence or the main idea at the start of the sentence, at the start of the paragraph, you give the reader the context like a bucket. And in that way, it's more easy to carry around the rest of the information in the paragraph, which would be analogous to the liquid in the bucket. And so the rest of the paragraph would be the information summarized by that main idea. I should add that there are no hard rules in writing so much as there are guidelines. I will say that one rule is that the definition of a paragraph is more than one sentence. That's the only thing that has to be. Now, you read the New York Times, the cover page of the New York Times, you'll notice that they violate that in almost every single sentence. They basically put a sentence per paragraph. But that's a newspaper. You're reading that on the fly, and articles in newspapers should be written so that they could basically be chopped at any point, right, to fit for the format. We recognize that the last sentence of the paragraph got more emphasis than the ones in the middle. And so I'm going to suggest that that could be analogous to a handle on the bucket. So the question is, what can you give your readers that will allow them to carry around that information in that context more easily? Our teachers did tell us that this is a place for a summary sentence. And that's a good idea. it would be kind of silly to repeat exactly what you said just 3 sentences earlier, right? I will say that I appreciate summary sentences, especially the ones that telegraph that it's a summary. For instance, in summary, da-da-da-da, or taken together, this data point for the need of da-da-da-da. But there's a little something else you can do in this last sentence that would help the reader retain the information. And that would be to suggest the importance of the idea, the significance of the idea, the relevance of the idea, and even in some cases, you might suggest what the reader is going to do as a result of knowing that information. For the most part, reading is a passive activity, and you have no guarantee that the reader is thinking after each sentence that he or she reads, why is this important to me? What am I going to do as a result of this information? A good author is going to take that extra step. Go ahead.
Can that be applied to like as a conclusion as a whole too? Because I know like some teachers want a summary, but maybe having that conclusion be like showing the importance or the significance instead.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, can this be applied to, the idea can be applied to the conclusion, like a conclusion paragraph? The idea that you might suggest the importance, the significance, the relevance, what you're going to do with it, the benefit in a conclusion paragraph, and the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, that I would argue would be the primary purpose of the conclusion paragraph. Not only suggests the conclusion of that overall paper, but the value of knowing that information. Absolutely yes. I first encountered this idea of the importance of putting, wherever reasonably possible, the significance type of sentence. I, in truth, encountered it first in sales training at the drug company. So let me tell you this story here. I had gone to the writer's workshop. I had then had a project. I made poetry videos, PTV I called it, like MTV but with poetry. I figured if MTV could make a crappy song popular, then PTV would make my poetry popular, right? So I was doing that. I was teaching at the community college here in town, Kirkwood Community College, composition and poetry. And so I get a job at the drug company. And my job was to teach this type of thing as a sales tool. But again, I needed to be groomed. And so my boss put me through sales training in 3 weeks of learning how to sell, learning how to wear a shirt and a tie, and being all corporate, the corporate headquarters of Bayer. I was paying attention this one day, and they taught us how to sell. Now, I'm using the word sell, but really what I'm talking about is framing your ideas so you emphasize the importance, significance, relevance, benefit. They put it like this. They said you have your features and you have your benefits. The features are your facts, your points, what you want to convey to your learners, your readers. The benefits are the value of knowing the facts, the significance, the relevance, the importance, the take-home message. The whole lesson in sales is that you sell on the benefits. You sell on the benefits. People remember your facts because you've gone the extra step to tell them why it's important. So in drug rep land in 1993, it would be, oh, once-a-day dosing, doctor, that's important because it leads to better patient compliance or better patient satisfaction. And then the whole idea is the doctor's going to write a prescription, and she remembers better patient compliance and then recalls the once-a-day dosing idea. Now, I'm using the word sales, and sales is not a really good word to use in the sciences, because in the sciences, you like the data to do the work. So I'm not going to use sales anymore. I'm going to say framing the information so that you hit, wherever reasonable, on the value of knowing the information. We're going to get into, in a bit, the report of original research. In an introduction, perfectly appropriate that you would put the benefits, the importance, significance. Methods and results section, not the place to put these value statements. But a discussion section, absolutely, totally valid to put the importance, significance. And then, as you mentioned, the conclusion section, absolutely valid to put the benefit, the importance, significance, relevance, what people are going to do with the information. We'll go through that report of research in a minute here. So I've been talking about the feature-benefit model of framing your ideas for about 20 years. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, my family and I were visiting another family on the West Coast. The dad is an engineer, and he writes in the petrochemical industry. And we're talking about this, and he told me he was taught the feature-benefit proof model of framing your ideas. And this makes absolute, total sense for those in the sciences. You say your point, you say the value of it, you give the evidence. Or someone in one of my seminars said, wouldn't it be more logical to do the feature, proof, benefit in that order? And I say, that's fine. That's perfectly logical. I'm okay with that. The idea being that you do want to include both of those extra ways to help the reader, or in this the presentation skills class we're doing in a couple weeks, the speaker, remember your points. Any questions about that or any thoughts about that? Okay. So we're in the second half here. We have reviewed the writing process. We reviewed clarity. We reviewed the natural position of emphasis in the sentence and the paragraph. Now we take that an extra step further and we look at the structure of the report of original research, or the formal study. And what I do is I make this funnel shape to emphasize, here we have objectives, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. Make this funnel shape to emphasize that anything you're going to ultimately forward as a conclusion has got to be accounted in the different sections of the study. And again, this is an example of how the editorial structure can help you with your scientific reasoning in coming to a conclusion, to help you make a better case for that conclusion to the reader. So the idea is that because of this problem that exists, I'll just say background. The introduction would include a paragraph or two of background and then the objective statements. Now, that's in say a clinical journal. In some other journals, we have many paragraph introduction or background, sometimes with 20 or 30 citations and references, really a whole literature review before we get to the objective statement. What I'm saying here is that if you're going to, for instance, write for Journal X and it has a 10-paragraph introduction section, then you're best advised to follow that general model. If you're going to write for a more clinical journal where it has only 2 or 3 paragraphs at most introduction, then you write in that style. But the idea being is that based on this background, an author would make an objective statement, the objective of the study. And I see objective statements being essentially written in 2 ways. I see directly stated objectives, and I see indirectly stated objective. Which is better? It would make sense, a lot of sense, that a directly stated objective is better. Now this is, again, take this with a grain of salt, because some fields of research you can only get so direct in the objective statement. Some areas of inquiry have research questions. And so again, you have to follow the conventions of that field. There are 3 surefire ways to state an objective directly. One is to use the word objective. Our objective is whatever it is, and then by the time I get to the conclusions, it would make sense that that objective would have been achieved and the conclusion made. Another one is to have an hypothesis, or better yet, use it as a verb. We hypothesize that, and then by the end of the study, I would expect that hypothesis to be confirmed or refuted. And then another way to state it objectively is to put it in the form of a question, which by the end of the study, you would have an answer to that question. So again, the format, the style that you choose, varies based on the purpose, the type of research, the field. The objective statement itself in a well-written piece would appear in a place of emphasis in that 2 or 3 paragraphs. So what I typically see is it appears either as the first sentence of the second or third paragraph, or sometimes it appears as the last sentence of the second or third paragraph in one of those clinical type of journals. Now, based on that objective, you design methods. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to go into depth about methods. This is something you learn from your classes, but it makes sense. 2 things that are worth repeating that I've heard over the years. One comes by way of Brian Gibler of the Annals of Emergency Medicine, who suggested that authors, before they review the world literature and looked at how everyone else has approached the problem, his suggestion was that you try to come up with your own novel methods. The idea being, you don't want to bias yourself against your novel idea just because you're so familiar with how everyone else has looked at it. The other point worth repeating came to me by way of a biostatistician at the University of Puerto Rico. And during one of the breaks, she came up to me and told me about her job, which was to review people's statistics especially, and in the method section. And the problem is that people were sending her manuscripts to review after they had collected all the results and made their conclusions. And it was too late to integrate any of her points. And the way she put it, she said, I'm awful about it, but she says, you don't take the patient to the emergency room after he's already dead. The idea being, you can't change your methods after you started to collect your results. So that's the point there is, get feedback on your methods and the statistics and anything you're not fully confident in to make sure that they're as solid as possible before moving on to that next stage of doing that study. So based on those methods then, you would get some results. What do you like looking at better when you read scientific articles, medical articles? Do you like reading the sentences and paragraphs, or do you like looking at the figures and the tables? We like figures and tables, right? So by all means, results, if they're better conveyed in figures and tables, then by all means take advantage of that. You'd want to make maximum use of often they have a limit to how many tables or figures you can send to accompanying the manuscript. Based on the results then, you go through the test of a discussion section. Now, discussion sections vary most among journals, and in fact, they vary most even among the articles within a given journal. First point to make, however, is the discussion section is the only section in which you're free to speculate as to the causes of things. That's part of the role of the discussion section, is to test out different ideas and to discuss. What I'm going to do is I'm going to explode the discussion section here on the right-hand side because, again, they vary so much. So this, in the discussion section especially, is a place where you might deconstruct a discussion section, make an outline based on that, and use it to inform your writing. In fact, what I say to the faculty at the College of Medicine here, 1,100 faculty, they can all send me their manuscripts. What I say to them is, if you want me to do a really good job, send me, along with not only your manuscripts, but send me a PDF of an article that appeared in that journal sometime in the last 3 years. And so what I do is I put them both on the screens there, and I look to that model article to see how I can make the manuscript fit better the way that they do it at that journal. I think about it because in one small example, the discussion section in the paper that had been published, I noticed, had 3 subsections. And in the manuscript I was editing, it was just 5 or 6 paragraphs. So that was an easy suggestion. I just took exactly those same 3 subheadings that were under discussion, and I found the appropriate place in the manuscript. I might have had to move a whole paragraph around or 2, but the idea is that we use those exact same subheadings in that discussion as well. We used an editorial approved format to convey that information. What I'm going to go through here, the order I'm going to propose here, as a means to help you think about the discussion section, I get from another great book on scientific writing, Edward Huth, called How to Write and Publish Papers in the Medical Sciences. This essentially is, I think, chapter 4, argument, structure, and reasoning in the scientific manuscripts. It makes sense, and I see most often, that readers start their discussion section by reviewing their main finding, the main result that they got. Huth suggests that authors start with a working conclusion. I was confused at first because I thought the conclusion came after at the bottom, and it does, but he's talking about the working conclusion, the conclusion based on this study alone. What the discussion section does is it considers the rest of the body of literature in that area and makes a case for how this work adds to the rest of the body of knowledge in that area. So it does it in 3 ways, tests the working conclusion in 3 main ways. It tests it as far as how it fits in literature, a literature review. In 1994, I drove across town in New Haven to the Yale AIDS series, and I listened to a bunch of different speakers, and one of them was Bill Blattner, epidemiology editor at the Journal of AIDS, who was talking about electronic publishing, and he talked about the body of scientific knowledge is like a jigsaw puzzle that grows from the inside out. A group of authors published a new study, it's like adding a piece to that puzzle. And you know, like a jigsaw puzzle, it's got to fit the nooks and crannies of what came before it. It's going to suggest the next step in that line of discovery. So I give you this analogy here to emphasize the role of the literature review in the discussion section. In it, you are making a case for how your work adds to the body of knowledge in that area. You test that working conclusion and its role in the literature, in particular, by paying close attention to the counter evidence, is the way Huth puts it. But the studies that do not agree with what you found, and then explain, offer possible reasons for that. And then you also test that working conclusion by acknowledging the limitations of the work. If you don't acknowledge the limitations, who will? Whose job is it to find out the weaknesses of a paper? When you submit to a journal, it goes to oftentimes 2 reviewers, and it's the reviewer's job to find out, to judge the strengths, relative limitations of that work. You can often head off some reviewers' comments at the turn by acknowledging those limitations, and frankly, most articles that I edit, they respond to them. So they often include not only a limitations section, but a strengths of the study. Strengths and limitations. So based on the test of this discussion section, then you would forward a conclusion. And the conclusion differs from this working conclusion here, in that this conclusion at the end of the paper is the conclusion about the issue itself. In other words, not only about this study alone, but the rest of the literature in that general topic. That's Huth's perspective. Your analysis of journals and your deconstructing of journals might give you, you might see a different role. In all honesty, lots of journal articles, the main conclusion is really just about this study itself and doesn't incorporate the rest of the literature. But I'm giving you the Huth's perspective, and he was the editor-in-chief of the Annals of Internal Medicine. He is the one who invented the structured abstract, the abstract that is divided into those little subheadings: background, the different methods, results, and conclusion, and has allowed authors to skip around a little bit. So talking about skipping around an article, and this is in support of putting the topic sentence at the top of the paragraph, especially for submissions to journals, especially for grant applications, which is still a ways away for you, but still you'll be writing applications, right? Applications to grad school, applications to different programs. And for those types of articles, those types of writing, I endorse that you, again, put the topic sentence at the beginning of the paragraph. So I will include personal statements with that advice, answers to questions. In the last 10 or 15 years, I've been on my anti-creativity and scientific writing crusade. And so we're going to do a little exercise in that, under that theme. It has to do with everything with following instructions and giving back. Let's say in an application you have a set of instructions, giving back the information exactly as they ask for them in the same order. So what I'll do is I will give you the first sentence of the instructions for a project description of an NIH grant application, and I'm going to ask you to write the first sentence of what you'd put in that project description. So you're just going to have to make this up. Really just write the first half of the sentence. Again, anti-creativity and scientific writing crusade. The instructions read, state the broad long-term goals of this proposal, of this project, paying attention to the health relatedness, blah, blah, blah. If I tell you or ask you to state the broad long-term goals of the project, if I say, what are the broad long-term goals of the project, how do you start the first sentence of the response? The broad long-term goals of this project are, right? So again, you don't have to reinvent the structure. You, in fact, want to use the language of the instructions as a means to incorporate it into your answers. And this is, again, a quality of good writing of applications. Thinking about how this flow of information works down in this cone shape, this funnel shape. Not being a scientist, I had to figure out a way to analyze this without all that scientific background from, again, the editor's perspective. And what I figured out is that if you worked backwards through this, it was more easy to identify the gaps in the reasoning. So what I would do, and this, when I started looking into it, like I mentioned, it was what, 93, 95. This is when you printed out something and the page was still attached, and so I'd have a long string of paper on the floor, and I'd take different colored markers and identify different sections. But ultimately what I do is I number the conclusions. Maybe there's 2, maybe there's 1, maybe there's 3. And I look backwards and I make sure that I can find, based on a given conclusion, where the authors dealt with it in literature review and the counter evidence and limitations. And then I like to go and I like to look into the results section and make sure I can find a result that would lead some logical person to that conclusion. And then I would go into the methods section to make sure that the method was reported to get that result, to get that conclusion. And then I want to go all the way back to find a directly stated objective to make sure, again, that that line of reasoning went all the way through, and in fact all the way up to the background information. And it was by looking backwards through it that you can more easily identify gaps in the information that's missing, and in particular when you are writing an abstract, because it's only 400 words long, it's a limited amount of spaces, even character spaces now, and information tends to get lost sometimes. So we have a follow-up handout that's a summary of this talk. Actually, 2 follow-up handouts that are a summary of the talk. One is the format, not only of the report of original research, but of the review article and the structure review and the case series and the case presentation, other types of articles you write with a reading list. And in the other handout, I called this concept of working backwards through it, I was just being tongue-in-cheek. I called it Casella's test of reasoning, right? It was my joke, Casella's test of reasoning. And one faculty did me great honor. He sent me a manuscript to review, and he asked me to be sure that I did Casella's retrograde test of reasoning. And I thought, oh, cool, retrograde, you know, space, NASA space program. But essentially that's the idea. It's to retrograde, to work backwards through it. You can, even though we did the report of original research here, you can apply this general concept to the other types of articles you'd write. So make a diagram, put the sections of them in there. You can create this diagram based on deconstructing an article and then creating this outline and then applying it to your information. Okay. We talked about the writing process early on, especially about the initial stages of the writing process. What I'm going to do is continue with the writing process as far as suggestions for the later stages of the writing process. So we'll make a timeline. And in fact, we'll make two timelines. One will be on the writing process, and the other will be on working to get things published. The whole point is that you can work on getting something published even if you're in the early stages of writing the information. And essentially that means being familiar with the journal, with the expectations of the journal and the formats. Journal editors are ultimately responsible to the readers. And you can learn a lot about what the readers care about of a given journal, for instance, in looking at the letters to the editor. So ultimately, again, I want to emphasize, you want to get a sense of the readership of a given forum. Likewise, early on, you want to look at what's called the Information to Authors page. And you can find these online now. You type the Information to Authors and the name of the journal, and you're a mouse click or two away. And even though it seems kind of basic stuff, like they want it double-spaced and margins like this and small stuff, you can get at least put it in the format that is conducive to that paper, that manuscript being sent out to the reviewers. If in the writing process you're going to trust what I say about using writing as a tool for thinking, I'm going to put, like, say, the first third of it as that free writing process. Again, creating a body of work from which you can come up with better ideas, see patterns in your ideas. But at a certain point, informed by the format of a given article, you ultimately want to come to a first draft. It, I should mention, helps if you early on set yourself some milestones, especially if you're writing with co-authors. With co-authors, you want to decide who is going to write what section and by when, and have a regular meeting time. Maybe it's going to be first every Monday morning, or every twice a month on Mondays. But if you have a regular meeting time where a clear set of expectations, who's going to do what, by when, it makes writing as a group a lot easier. It would be important to establish the order of the authorship also early on also, so that you don't have to fight about that later. So you get a first draft. You have an opportunity for the other authors to give feedback and review that first draft, but very important, you do want to establish a system of feedback, whether it be your mentors, whether it be other classmates, senior mentors, junior mentors. The idea is that you would send them that manuscript and you'd tell them the purpose, and you would ask them for ways to improve that manuscript. So if you're going to get that feedback, then you should plan on time that you can revise that information. You're getting close to submission now, and oftentimes it used to be a cover letter you'd include, but now really it's just a box in the electronic upload submission site where you would have an opportunity to include some comments that accompany that submission. Thinking back to our feature benefit model, I can give you a very quick outline for a cover letter, very simple. First is to tell the purpose. you're writing to submit, you've uploaded this article, and you hope that they would consider it for review and publication. And then here's your opportunity to suggest why that issue is important to who? To the readers of that journal. So these sentences might be a few sentences. You don't want to go more than a page or a couple of paragraphs, but they can come straight from your manuscript itself, probably. You can copy and paste them in there. And the idea is that you would give that associate editor a reason to send it off to 2 reviews and get it in the review process. It's very rare to get an article submitted on the first submission anymore. And don't mean to say anymore at all. It's rare that it gets accepted right away for publication. More likely, in a perfect world, it gets a conditional acceptance with some feedback that the reviewers have identified they want you to take it to revise, to look at. It might be that you get rejected, but you still get I don't mean you get rejected, the manuscript does not get accepted, but you get the reviewer feedback. And this is also good news. This is part of the writing process, part of the publishing process. This is how the scientific community does peer review and makes articles not presentable, but makes sure that they're highest quality that they can be. I remember talking to a junior faculty at Scott and White Hospital in Temple, Texas. He told me that his first submission, did not get accepted. The manuscript got rejected, and he was devastated, he said, because the comments by the reviewers were longer than his manuscript itself, right? And so he was deflated, and he goes to his boss and he tells him, "Look, boss, look what an awful job I did. The reviewers had all these negative comments about it, more than." And his boss said, "Wait a second, are you kidding? This is good news. They've done all that work for you. Start retyping, start incorporating those ideas, or start examining those issues." Of course, if you agree with the reviewer comments, then by all means, it's easy to revise that. Let's say you agree with most of them, but let's say there's 1 or 2 that you don't agree with. Do you change them to reflect what the reviewers think anyway? No, because it's your intellectual property, as it were. Do you ignore those items completely? No, because if 2 expert reviewers out there brought it up as an issue, then there might be other readers who think about that. No, what you do is you bring up those issues, but you write what you think about them, right? For instance, you could say, one school of thought says this, that, and the other thing, however, and then you give your counter argument to it. So writing process and publishing process, again, is a process. It continues. And again, especially with grant applications. You cannot go into writing a grant application thinking that this is the one and only time. You got to look at it as not getting funded, getting the feedback, revising, resubmitting. Talking about applications then, same goes for applications to graduate programs. And as you know, it's no secret why we have this writing assignment, daily writing assignment. Again, as Dr. Martinez made a case for a few weeks ago, is to allow you to build a body of work from which you can take the best stuff. I find that keeping my journal and then every 2 or 3 months reading through it and seeing what patterns emerge, and then I highlight the good stuff and I type out the good stuff, I work on about a 10-to-1 ratio. For every 10 pages of material I write in that free writing mode early on in the process, I ultimately come away with 1 page of good stuff, stuff that I want to continue working on, maybe submitting somewhere, getting feedback from colleagues on. Maybe if you have more clear direction as far as the topic, maybe you can improve that ratio. But again, that's what I find myself working on. And part of it is finding that perfect time and place wherever possible. I mean, it might be that you just have to randomly catch 15 minutes here and there during the day, but in a perfect world, you would find the time that is the quietest and most conducive to reflection. About 5 or 8 years ago, I was busy editing this very big grant application, the CTSA $35 million grant application that we ultimately got. Took a couple of different tries, but I found that my best working time was about 6:30 to 8:30 in the morning, maybe 6 to 8 in the morning, where I was most productive. And then my daughter was in grammar school at the time. Then I would have a great half an hour break, and I'd walk her to school, and then come back, get another 2-3 hours of work in. And then by 11 o'clock, I just couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to go for my jog, needed to do something else. Of course, I'd be 2.5 miles away in the middle of Hickory Hill Park, and when would that perfect paragraph gel in my head? When I was the farthest away from the computer, right? So in the end, I started carrying a little index card with me, much like, well, 20 years earlier, I was carrying my recorder over the Brooklyn Bridge every day. So we go back to applications. And tomorrow, in the follow-up to this session, where we have more of a workshop, we're going to do other exercises. Essentially, we're going to pair up, have each other interview each other, and have each other write little background summaries of each other's experiences, because that might give you additional insight into writing effective personal statements, applications for your applications. But I want to make a few comments right up front now about personal statements, again, that you would use for many different type of purposes. They're called personal statements, but in fact, they're more professional statements. How you look at the summary of your experiences so far that has led you to this professional, have led you to your goal of entering some type of profession. In personal statements, or again, professional statements, you want to make sure that you detail your successes. Grant writing or application writing differs from, say, writing for the journals in that you really need to toot your own horn. It'll feel like you are overdoing it. So when I say, so there's this term, have you heard this term, the humble brag? The humble brag, right? Well, you got to do a lot of humble bragging in personal statements. I suggest, and now some of these you're going to have heard before resonate, because if you want to blame anyone for coming up with those 49 prompts for your daily writing exercise, blame me, because I'm the one who came up with most of them. But I suggest that you, in personal statements, talk about the challenge that you faced and how you overcame them, because they make for good stories. At this point, I'll tell a story. And this is my brother-in-law, Jay. He is a lawyer, but early on, after college didn't really work for him the first time he tried, he joined the Army and ultimately became a paratrooper. So Jay was a paratrooper in the Army for 3 or 4 years, and then he went on and got his degree, and he was a nurse. And then he went on and worked as a psych nurse at the Federal Medical Detention Center in Rochester, Minnesota. So it's a big prison. It's like prison. It's a hospital, multi-building campus. And he was a nurse in the psych ward. So he's got great stories. But after doing that for 5 or 7 years, he decides he wants to go to law school. And because we had banged heads for 2 or 3 years together in Iowa City, he wisely called up the writer and said, hey, I need help. You need to write a personal statement. And because I knew all of his great stories from being in the Army, I said, oh, I know exactly how we're going to start this thing. We're going to talk about the story about when you parachuted in with the general. And the story went like this. He's a grunt in the Army, right? He's a paratrooper. Paratroopers want to do lots of jumps. That's what they do. They're paratroopers. The whole thing is to get 100 jumps in. So anyway, their commanding officer comes to his group and says, asked for volunteers who is willing to jump out of a plane at this reunion of paratroopers with the general and his aide. And so Jay, raises his hand, and he gets to be the volunteer. So normally it would be the general would jump first, then the general's aide, and then the grunt, right? But the general's feeling rusty, and he says to Jay, hey, do you want to take the door position? You want to go out first? Because I'm a little rusty. So Jay says yes. So the plane gets up there, Jay jumps out, the general jumps out, then the general's aide. Because the general's aide would never go before the general, right? But the grunt can go. So anyway, Jay floats down, he lands. 2 staff officer jeeps pull up, 8 guys jump out. Some of them are rolling up his parachute. 2 of them are picking Jay up, and they go, wait, you're not the general, where's the general? And Jay says, oh, the general was the second one out of the plane. And so they dump him on the ground, they dump his stuff, they get in the staff jeeps, they drive away. And Jay is walking into the turning point with his parachute thinking, there's nothing more than I want to be than an officer in the U.S. Army. Okay, we said it in fewer words than that, but that was a little story we started the personal statement with. Well, what happens? 3 or 4 paragraphs later, he gets his nursing degree, now he's got a bachelor's, and bang, you're already an officer in the U.S. Army. So it was a fun story. You could see the selection committee talking around who they're going to admit, saying, let's admit the paratrooper, But it also showed a success. Like he said he wanted to be an officer, and then a few paragraphs later he got to be an officer. So a lot of things going on, and the power of telling stories and giving examples is something that you can harness in your personal statement. I suggest that in a personal statement for a graduate program in which you would be a student or a trainee, that you also talk about your mentors and you tell what you learned and from whom. And these can be traditional mentors, they can be non-traditional mentors, they can be coaches, they can be neighbors, they can be parents. But think about it. You're applying to be a student somewhere. You want to show that you have the ability to learn. And their job is to teach. So they want to admit people who have the ability to learn from them. Very important. I suggest you tell why that you're interested in, or better yet, the story of what happened that made you become interested in a certain thing. In one example, I'm working with a physician, a newly minted graduate of a medical school, is applying to residency programs. Maybe it was fellowship programs, I forget, but he's applying in ophthalmology, in eyesight, right? And the little story he came up with, because I pressed him, I'm like, how come you picked this? How come? He said he was online at Disneyland, or Disney World, online to see a 3D movie, and there was a family with a little boy who had an eye patch on one eye. And he realized that, the 3D effect wasn't going to work with just one eye, and that's how he got interested. Small little story, shows a little compassion, and it's a detail. I suggest also you convey your overall vision for your professional life. Now that's hard if you say to someone, what's the vision for your life? That takes a lot of self-reflection and writing on a daily basis and reading it, using the writing process. We talked about the feature benefit model here. That's another suggestion I have for personal statements, and that is to use the feature benefit model of emphasizing the value, what you got from what you have done, and what you plan to do to help others in the area. In Jay's personal statement, because he had worked in the psych unit and then later was working in a nursing home, he put in his personal statement for law school that he was interested in doing elder law, protecting the rights of the elderly, people, for instance, who are in nursing homes. So he played by his strengths, right? Played by his experience as working in a nursing home, as working in, the story about being in the Army. The College of Medicine here is a writing center, and the part of the goal of the writing center is to help the medical school students write good personal statements for residency programs. In talking with Jason, the director of that, he said he applies the basic 5-paragraph essay to the personal statement. And if you remember what that is, it's a paragraph of introduction, 3 paragraphs of body and examples, and a paragraph of conclusion. So ideally, and there would be page limits or word limits or maybe character limits, but ideally if you use a single-spaced, if you do single-spaced, that's about 500 words per page, you should be able to fit your personal statement on a single page, roughly about 500 words. Consider the 5-paragraph model. Introduction, body, 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 conclusion. That shows a control of the writing method or the control of the language. You don't want them to go on and on for pages and pages, and no doubt there will be a word limit. Of course, the way to write a good 500-word personal statement is to write a 1,500-word personal statement and then to chop out the less important stuff, the less interesting stuff. I have here also outline your plans for the future and how you expect to accomplish them. So one strong organization for a personal statement might be past, present, and future. That's why you'll see a lot of these prompts for the daily writing exercise, where you want to be in 5 years, where you want to be in 15 years, where you want to be in 10 years. Start having you think and reflect about your future so you can incorporate that into these personal statements. Again, I talked about writing about your mentors and your teachers and what you've learned from them. And then just as an example, what I've done here is, and this page will also be included in the handouts. I have copied and pasted the instructions for the NIH BioSketch, which includes a section on the personal statement. And I'm going to read you the instructions for the NIH BioSketch personal statement, because you're going to see, again, more advice and a lot of related advice. The instructions say, briefly describe why you are well suited for your role in the project. So that becomes a sentence starter. I am well suited for a student in this program because. Use the exact same terminology. Relevant factors may include aspects of your training, your previous experimental work on this specific topic or related topics, your technical expertise, your collaborators or scientific or I'll add educational environments, and your past performance in this or related fields. So again, this list of 5 or 10 things all can be used to inform your writing of your professional statement. What stands out for me especially is why you're well suited for your role in the project. So for instance, if you're writing a personal statement as part of an application for graduate program X, you want to do a little research about graduate program X. You would be well advised to make a case for instance, which investigators, which scientists would be able to help you advance your field most, how you're a good fit for that program, because really, graduate programs are less looking for the smartest candidates, but the ones that are the best fit for a given program. So some knowledge of that and addressing that can do much to put your application into the finalist spot. Any questions? Please.
I was just wondering, referring to personal statements, if you noticed any really common errors that...
Common errors in personal statements?
Things that people talk about or they shouldn't have, things like that.
Oh, okay, things they talked about that they shouldn't have. So the short answer is no. But I will say that what would be more appropriate in a personal statement as opposed to less appropriate is, we talked about what most appropriate already. Your accomplishments, why you're best suited for the role, and I'm here to emphasize the power of stories and to give evidence, feature benefit proof evidence. Where I think personal statements would get uninteresting is if they talk in vague terms, if there's no clear sense of direction. Like the truth is, maybe you really don't know exactly where you want to be in 25 years, right? But you can hit on the core values that you'd bring to whatever profession you want to go into. I mean, I'll take a step back. I just finished a tour of the Great Plains, different places, Vermilion and Fargo and Kearney, Nebraska, so all across the Great Plains, and I did a whole series of grant writing talks. And the point that I'm getting to is that the goal of the Public Health Service, under which the NIH exists, and many funding applications go to NIH, the goal of the Public Health Service is not to fund good research, is to improve the health of Americans, okay? I think about that because if, for instance, you're interested in going into healthcare, it would be perfectly reasonable that you want to do that to improve the health of your fellow citizens and your communities. And your communities not include the one that you're from or your state or the nation, but they would include the worldwide community. I hope. My little daughter used to walk to school back in the story I told 15 minutes ago, is now a rising junior in college. She's between sophomore and junior year. I imagine a lot of you were right about that age too, right? I do hope that she finds like at least one semester to do in Europe or in South America, to do some kind of global exchange program. And I'm going to give the same advice to you all. I had one semester in Mexico when I was in college as a sophomore, and I tell you, it was the most eye-opening and important experience that I had in college. I got back, being able to speak Spanish, dream in Spanish, understand Spanish, and I got back to the U.S. thinking, if I can get what I want in Mexico in Spanish, then there's nothing I can't get in English in my own country. Very empowering, and you get insights on a global level. So that's what I'll just leave you with. And if it's not in a different country, then maybe it's in a different community. I know my nephew just graduated from Iowa, and my biggest advice for him was to join the Peace Corps, because that will be an experience that will last you for a lifetime. And so I pass along that encouragement to you too. Try to get out of your community, especially if you can get college credit for it. Okay, so a quick summary of what we have addressed today. We talked about clarity. We talked about the writing process, how you can use writing as a tool for thinking. We talked about the value of taking an everyday approach to the writing process. You can do that for your personal statements, but likewise for the other types of writing you will have to do as a profession in the health sciences and the sciences in general. We talked about the natural positions of emphasis in the sentence and the paragraph, and we went through the structures of the report of original research. Again, the kind of gold standard type of report that scientists submit and look to get published and look to advance knowledge in the field. We talked about the process as far as submitting an article to a journal, and then we talked some about the personal statement. Now, one last comment. I did this with the group last year, but Iowa City has 2 or 3 festivals during the summer. We had Arts Fest already. Jazz Fest happens around the 4th of July weekend. I know that you're looking to build your resumes. And so in a very important section of your resume is the volunteer activities or community service. So I'm going to leave you with this. If you're in town anyway, June 29th, 30th, and July 1st, Iowa City is a lot of fun to go to these festivals and listen to music and eat the food, but you might consider volunteering for a 3-hour shift at Jazz Fests, because it goes under community service. You're here anyway. If you're over 21, you could work in the beer tent and, wipe off beers, but what you do is you go to summerofthearts.com. Summerofthearts.com. And you find the appropriate link to volunteer. Again, 3-hour shifts, you get a free t-shirt. They need people to man booths and just make sure that everything goes well. And one of the students in this program last year, he actually volunteered for the first aid, little first aid tent. And I thought, wow, really smart, right? Not just volunteering for the community, but doing, first aid into what he was interested in. Okay, we'll see you all tomorrow. You're welcome. Summerofthearts.org. Sorry, summerofthearts.org.
Hey, everyone, before you guys leave.